This is a story of my Alaska adventure with John Carlton on September 8th through the 22nd, 1978. I had been home teaching John Carlton for some time, and during our visits we discussed the idea of going hunting. The idea appealed to both of us, so we made arrangements to go to Alaska on a moose and grizzly bear hunt. We left at 3 a.m. from Gallup and drove to Albuquerque and flew to Denver, Seattle, and landed in Anchorage. Upon landing, however, we found out that our rifles hadn't arrived. Boy, talk about a shock. Here we go hunting and no rifles. Well, we went to a local sporting goods store, and the clerk there was gracious enough to loan us two of his rifles. I couldn't hardly believe it, but he said he would, so we took him up on it. However, the next day, just as we were getting ready to leave, we called the airport, and our rifles did show up. Well, that was good. So we took his rifles back and got ours and flew out on a beaver about 120 miles northwest of Anchorage, up in what's known as the Alaska Range. As we were flying over the country, we saw moose and bear below us, and it was just a beautiful country. We landed in a small lake with this float plane, got out, and our guide met us. We hiked probably a couple miles to a grass-roofed old log cabin, and which was his campsite, and made arrangements and settled down, getting ready to go hunting the next day. We each had a guide, and my guide and I decided that we would go up into the higher country looking for bear, and John was going to go up the river and go to the lower country and hunt moose with his guide. So the next morning we took off, and as we were getting up into the higher country, lo and behold, across the canyon there stood a big moose, and it had a nice spread of horns, and the guide said, well, I don't know what he's doing up this high, but it's unusual. And so he said, do you want to take him or do you want to wait? And with the idea, you take what you get, because you never know whether you get another chance or not. So settled down, laid down, took aim across this small canyon. It's probably about 150 yards shot, and with my 300 Weatherby, and squeezed the trigger, and he was standing broadside to me, and he didn't even move after I shot. I thought, well, that's kind of unusual. And the guide asked me, he said, did you sight your rifle in? I said, yeah, it shoots all right. So I shot again, and still nothing. He didn't twitch an ear. And so the guy said, well, maybe you're off. And I said, no, it's shooting out. Well, I'll take one more shot. So I shot again, and after I shot the third time, the moose just collapsed right where he was standing. And so we went over, and when we cleaned it out and everything, we found the heart had just been shattered. He had 3 bullet holes in him, but he had just was killed right standing on his feet and was just holding himself up for some reason. But anyway, we took time to take the skin off and cut the horns off the skull, and the horns weighed probably about probably close to 60 to 70 pounds. And so I put that on my backpack and finally stood up, and the guide loaded up the hide, which is probably another 60, 70 pounds, and put that on his pack. And then we grabbed the back strap, which is the best part of the meat, and hiked on out. We had camped in a spike camp, which is probably about 3 miles from our base camp. But we went ahead and hiked on out to the base camp with all our gear, and it took us the rest of that day. And when we got there, we undid everything. I was hoping to find John, and a little bit later they came in, and he had shot a moose in a lake. And the worst thing you can do is shoot a moose in a lake, because they're hard to clean. But they asked for some help, so I left my guide there at the cabin and went with John and his guide and went up there, and tipping on tiptoes, we had to quarter his moose and drag it out of the lake and then skin it. But while I was doing that, I had put my sling on a small tree that was coming out of the lake, and the weight was too heavy, I guess, and a branch broke, and I turned around, kaplunk, and my rifle had dropped into the lake. And I picked it up, but later, to my dismay, the scope became a little bit foggy with the moisture in it. I could see, but it was foggy. But anyway, it was late, and we got back to the cabin. So the next day, my guide and I went back up to get the rest of the moose meat, and John and his guide was going to work on his other moose, and that's still partially in the lake, and they had to finish skinning it and get his cape and everything on it. So my guide and I went up there, and when we got to where the moose was laying, to our surprise, there was a big sow grizzly bear and 2 cubs that were enjoying the meat. And the guide said, "Hey, we're not going to tangle with her, so we just have to let her sit there, and there's all the meat we had is gone." So I was really disappointed. I wanted to try and scare her away, but the guide said, "No, we're not going to chance that. She'll come after us, particularly where she's got those sows there to protect." So that was a little bit scary, and anyway, we backed off and spent the night in our spike camp, which was just a 2-man tent, and we had a little heater that heated the water, and we had mountain house food that we ate. And the next morning, the guide woke up early, and as he was getting out of the tent, he came back in real quick and said, "Hey," he says, "your grizzly bear is right up there on the ridge." And so I got up and looked, and sure enough, about a quarter of a mile away or so, I could see this brown blob on the hillside. So we hurried and got dressed and got our rifles and snuck up to within about 100 yards of that grizzly bear, and he was just eating these blueberries on the hillside. And laid down. The guide said, "Do you want to use my rifle?" And I said, "No, I still feel comfortable with mine, even though that's a little bit foggy." So I zeroed on and aimed right behind the shoulder and squeezed the trigger, and the bear made a hump, but he lumbered over the ridge line. It was right on a crest of a ridge, and he went down the other side. So we went up to where I'd shot him, and we had blood all over the place. And of course, the rules of the hunt are that you're supposed to go after a wounded animal if you shoot him. So we waited about a half an hour or so, hoping that he would die or stiffen up and not be able to go any further before we took off after him. But as we started going down to the brush, it was so thick The guide was in front of me, and I was right behind him, but we couldn't see over 2 feet ahead of us. All we had was just smashed vines and twigs and brush that the bear was going through, and we had blood on all the twigs, but we couldn't see anything around us. I mean, it was just like walking through a tunnel. And I had a .44 Magnum in my belt, ready to grab, and of course I had my .300 Weatherby, and I figured, man, if that bear attacks, I got maybe one shot, and that's it, because the guide's not going to have a chance if he comes out of that brush after us. But as we were going down this hill, the guide turned around real quick and said, "Hey, watch out behind you." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, the trail's turning." And the bear had turned and tried to go uphill a little bit, and apparently maybe trying to circle around behind us, but he was hurting so bad he couldn't do it. So he kept on going downhill, and we followed him. Came to a creek, and we had blood right up to the edge of the creek. But it was a little bit too swift for us to cross, even though we had our hip boots on. So we went upstream a little bit, crossed the stream, came back down to where we thought the place was where we'd crossed, but we couldn't pick up any sign on the other side of the creek at all. And the guide says, let's split up. I'll go on downstream a little bit and see if I can pick up sign, and you look around here and back up a little bit more and see if you can pick up sign. I felt fairly secure with the guide with me all the time, but boy, as soon as he made a couple steps and was out of sight, I kind of had an idea of what Custer must have felt like. Like, what am I doing here? I have a wife, children back home, and under these circumstances, I don't think my life insurance agent is going to be very happy. But boy, it was scary. What hair I had left on my head was sticking up like antennas, and I don't recall ever being so alert and sensitive to anything that may happen around me. But after looking for about a half an hour, neither one of us found any more sign, and it was getting dark, so we decided to let well enough alone and bag it and head for our tent, which we did. When we got back to our tent and camped out, we decided it was getting late. We needed to head on back to our base camp. And so the next day we got back there, and then we heard John's story. He had gone back up there, and it had rained the previous night. He was coming down the river with his guide in a little boat and went up the wrong channel and made a turn, and the water got in the back of the boat, and it sunk. Well, the guide was able to jump free, but John had his brand new 7mm rifle, and he had his not the bear, but the moose horns. And so when he went down, he had his rifle in one hand, and he was trying to save everything, and his boots filled up with water, and his head went underwater. So he told me, he said, I was either my rifle or my life. And so he dropped his rifle and grabbed frantically for some twigs along the shoreline to pull himself out, and finally was able to. But he just almost drowned. And at the conclusion of telling us the story, he said, Dale, whatever happens, he said, when we get back home, he said, I want you to make sure that you help me get to the temple and get sealed to my wife and children. And which, after we did get back home 6 months later, from then he was able to, and we were able to get him sealed to his family. And it was a special occasion. But the other aspect of this story, the day before we left there to fly back, they had a couple moose that they had killed earlier, and there was still some remains laying probably about 100 yards from the cabin or so. And so John's guide said, hey, John, let's go check and see if maybe there's some bear out there eating that moose. And so John was discouraged. He said, nah, I don't want to. He said, I don't have no rifle or whatever. And the guy said, well, hey, you can use my rifle. So anyway, they left, and it was almost dark, but they left and went back there, and they hadn't been gone 15 minutes, and all of a sudden we heard a bang, and then a pop, and we thought, well, they're just probably target practicing. About a few minutes later, the door of the cabin sprung open, and the guide jumped in and said, "We got him." "What?" "Yeah," he says, "we got a grizzly bear. I need some help." So we grabbed our guns and went back up there, and sure enough, they had got a nice big grizzly bear. And from what they told us, what happened is that when they approached the dead moose, there were two grizzlies eating on them, and when they got themselves in position, the bears raised up on their hind legs and growled at them, and the guide told John to shoot, but he was too scared to at first. One bear dropped down, took off running, and the other one was still standing, growling, and John finally collected himself and shot, and the bear fell and went up the trail a little ways, and the guide said, "Come on, John, let's go get him." And John says, "I'm not." He said, "I'm staying right here." So the guide went on up there with his pistol and finished him off. Anyway, when we got there, it was turning dark, and we took a lantern with us. And we had an extra guide that came in a few days earlier and had a dog. And so there was 3 guides and the dog and John and I. So one of us held the lantern up real high to see around us, because now it was pitch black. And 2 of us had rifles for guards, and 2 of the guides started skinning the bear out, and the dog was, of course, sitting there. And because we knew that other grizzly was around somewhere, and it wasn't really a comfortable feeling, particularly when all of a sudden the dog got to his feet and started looking out in the dark beyond the circle of light and started growling. We were anticipating a charge, but never did happen, thank goodness. But anyway, we skinned that grizzly bear and got the hide and everything off of it, and then we had to hike back to the cabin. One person in the center was holding a light up in the air as high as they could, and we were all real close together as we hiked back to the cabin. And all we could see was probably about 10 feet in diameter around that light. But we made it back to the cabin all right and got in and settled down. And the latrine, or the restroom, was probably about 20 yards from the cabin, but that night nobody ventured out to go to it. If they had to go, they just cracked the door open and went out the crack. It was really funny. But anyway, the next day the plane came and got us. But the other part of the story, at the very first, the same plane that flew us in to Alaska, or back to this small lake, it was a beaver and a pilot. The very next day after he'd brought us in, the next day he went to another lake with 5 other hunters and crashed and killed everybody. And so on the cabin that we had a radio. Of course, you only hear one-way communication, so we were informed of that, but we were also told of the departure date. They would have another plane and pilot in there to get us out. So when the plane came in, they ferried us from our small lake to a larger lake several times to make sure we had enough length to put everybody in and then take off and get back to Anchorage. When we got back there, we made arrangements to have the meat frozen and boxed, and got our rifles and was able to get all that done in one day, and got on a plane and made it safely back home. It was quite an experience, and one that a trip of a lifetime.